Chapter 3. The Lindbergh Kidnapping. It was evening on Tuesday, March 1st, 1932. Charles and Anne Lindbergh finished dinner at their large country house near the village of Hopewell in New Jersey, USA, and Charles Lindbergh went to work in his library. Soon after 9 p.m., he heard a noise like something breaking, but it was a stormy night, and he thought it was probably thunder. His wife heard nothing. Upstairs, their son, Charles Jr., often called Little It, was asleep in his bed. Just after 10 p.m., Betty Gow, the child's nurse, went to check that Charles Jr. was all right. She found the little bed empty and the child missing. Quickly, she went to find Mrs. Lindbergh, but the boy was with neither his mother nor his father. In the child's bedroom, the window was open, and there was rainwater and dirt on the floor. There was also an envelope. Lindbergh called the police, and they hurried to the house. Detectives quickly found a rough wooden ladder about 25 meters from the window of the child's bedroom, and 2 footprints in the garden. The top step of the ladder was broken, and Charles Lindbergh remembered the noise he had heard earlier. A detective checked the envelope for fingerprints, but found none. He opened it. Inside was a note in poor English. Dear Sir, have $50,000 ready, $25,000 in $20 bills, $15,000 in $10 bills, and $10,000 in $5 bills. After 2 to 4 days, we will inform you where to deliver the money. We warn you for making any ding public or for notifying the police. The child is in good care. At the bottom of the letter were 2 open blue circles and a filled blue circle where they touched. The Lindberghs were very rich and famous people. Charles Lindbergh was the first man to fly a plane alone across the Atlantic, from New York to Paris, in 33.5 hours in 1927. And Anne Lindbergh was the daughter of Dwight Morrow, one of the richest bankers in the East. And now, their son had been kidnapped. Soon, all America heard the news on the radio or read it in their newspapers the next morning. President Hoover promised to do everything he could to see that the kidnappers were caught. Al Capone, the famous American criminal who was in prison at that time, offered to help find the child through his friends and contacts in the criminal world. For this, he wanted his freedom. The U.S. government refused his offer. Usually, the Lindberghs only went to their Hopewell home at weekends. Normally, they spent the rest of the week with Anne Lindbergh's family in Englewood, which was nearer to New York. But Charles Jr. had caught a cold, and Mrs. Lindbergh wanted him to stay at Hopewell until he was better. So how did the kidnappers know that the Lindberghs were there that Tuesday evening? It was one of the first questions detectives asked. People working for the Lindberghs were immediately suspected of having a part in the kidnapping. The child's nurse, Betty Gow, was questioned carefully, but the police finally let her go. Another woman working at the Lindbergh house, 28-year-old Violet Sharp, first told the police that she was at the cinema on the night of the kidnapping. Later, she changed her story and said that she had been with a man. In May, she changed her story again. On June 10th, when she heard that the police wanted to question her once more, she killed herself. Lindbergh told the newspapers that he would not try to injure the kidnappers if they returned the boy safely when they got the money. He then hired 2 criminals to try and contact the kidnappers. But before Lindbergh's helpers could do anything, the kidnappers made contact with Dr. John Francis Condon, a 72-year-old teacher who sometimes wrote for the New York paper Bronx Home News. He was told to take Lindbergh's money to the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. A meeting time was arranged over the telephone, and Condon went to the cemetery. He saw an Italian-looking man walk by with something across half his face, and guessed that the man was checking to see if there were any police or detectives around. Then Condon saw a second man standing in the shadows, his hat pulled down over his face and something covering his mouth. When the second man spoke, Condon recognized the voice. It was the man who had spoken to him on the telephone. He was about 35 years old and had brown hair. He said his name was John, and that there were 6 people in the gang, 2 of them women. He told Condon that the child was well, but then asked, "Would I burn if the baby is dead? Would I burn if I did not kill it?" By "would I burn," he meant would he die in the electric chair, the punishment used in America at that time for kidnappers and murderers. Condon saw the danger at once. If the police caught a kidnapper, he would die, whether the kidnapped child lived or not. So if a kidnapper thought he was going to be caught, he would kill the child. Condon and the man made more arrangements to contact each other. Then Cemetery John, as he became known, disappeared into the night. Several more messages were passed between the 2 men, and then Condon received a package in the post. Inside were Charles Lindbergh Jr.'s sleeping suit and a note making arrangements for the money to be handed to the kidnappers. At 7:45 p.m. on Saturday, April 2, 1932, Condon and Lindbergh went to Raymond Cemetery in the Bronx. Lindbergh waited in the car, while Condon went into the cemetery. They both heard a voice shout, "Hey, Doc!" Soon after, the man calling himself John appeared, with his hat pulled down over his face. "I have $50,000, said Condon. The man gave him a note. It said that the boy was on a boat called Nellie, near the Elizabeth Islands off the coast of Massachusetts. Lindbergh searched for several days, but he never found the boat. Then, on May 12th, 2 lorry drivers found the body of Charles Lindbergh Jr. in some woods about 7 kilometers from the Lindberghs' Hopewell house. He had died only a few hours after the kidnapping on March 1st. The police knew the numbers on the dollar bills which Condon gave to the kidnappers, and they began to watch for them. But it was September 16th, 1934, before detectives caught a 34-year-old German, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, when he paid for petrol with a $10 bill, one of the Cemetery John bills. When Hauptmann was arrested, police found another of the bills in his pocket, and at his home they discovered another $13,760 of Lindbergh's money. They also learned that Hauptmann was a carpenter whose job it was to make things from wood, like ladders. Hauptmann said that the money belonged to a business friend, Isidor Fisch, who had gone back to Germany and died there in March 1934. Hauptmann said Fisch had left the money behind when he went to Germany, and because Fisch had owed Hauptmann about $7,500, Hauptmann had taken it. "I had no part in the kidnapping," Hauptmann told detectives, "and I did not write the notes to Lindbergh." But the police refused to believe him, and they said that the writing on the notes was the same as Hauptmann's. At the trial in January 1935, Charles Lindbergh said that he recognized Hauptmann's voice. He also changed his story. He now said that Cemetery John had called, "Hey, Doctor," and not, "Hey, Doc," and that he had spoken with a foreign accent. Dr. Condon, who was at first not sure that Hauptmann was Cemetery John when questioned by the police, said at the trial that he was now sure that the German was the man to whom he had spoken in the cemetery. The jury believed both men. Hauptmann said that he had been working in New York at the time of the kidnapping. His wife and employer both agreed with this, although his employer would not speak at the trial, but the papers to prove it could not be found. The jury finally decided that Bruno Hauptmann was guilty of kidnapping and murder, and he died in the electric chair at Trenton State Prison, New Jersey, on April 3, 1936. But questions are still asked about the trial. Was the writing on the kidnap notes really Bruno Hauptmann's? How did Hauptmann know that Charles Lindbergh and his family were at the house near Hopewell on that stormy night in March 1932? He told the police that he had never been to the village of Hopewell and that he did not know it. We shall probably never know the whole truth. End of Side 1, Chapter 4. The Great Train Robbery. In the early hours of August 8, 1963, the night mail train from Glasgow to London's King's Cross Station was making good time. But for the driver, 58-year-old Jack Mills, and his assistant, 26-year-old David Whitby, this would be a night they would remember for the rest of their lives. Mills, especially, would always be a sick man, and indeed would die young after what was about to happen. Nearly all the train's 12 coaches were used as offices for the Royal Mail, for sorting the letters and packets into groups for different towns and cities. One special coach, for valuable packets, was carrying 128 bags of old money. The money was old banknotes, which were on their way to the Royal Mint, the place where banknotes are made, to be destroyed. At 3:03 a.m., almost 80 kilometers from London, and near the small village of Cheddington, Jack Mills suddenly saw a red signal. He immediately brought his engine to a stop. It was unusual to find a red signal here, so David Whitby got out of the engine to walk to the emergency telephone, which was behind a signal box. But two men in black balaclava helmets, later known to be Buster Edwards and Bob Welsh, came out of the darkness and pushed him down on the ground at the side of the railway. One man told Whitby, "If you shout, I'll kill you." Two men climbed into the engine, and Jack Mills tried to fight them. One of the men hit Mills over the head. Meanwhile, others in the gang quietly and efficiently unfastened the 10 sorting coaches at the back of the train, leaving just the front 2 fastened to the engine. The valuable packets coach was the second of these. David Whitby was brought back, and the robbers made Jack Mills drive the train very slowly to Bridego Bridge, 600 meters down the railway. They left the other 10 coaches behind. The 70 sorters, still working inside them, did not realize what was happening. Other gang members, wearing balaclavas and army uniforms, were waiting at the bridge with Land Rovers and a 3-ton army lorry. They had tied something white to a stick by the railway to mark the place where they wanted the engine to stop. They broke the windows of the valuable packets coach and made the post office sorters lie down on the floor. Next, the robbers passed 120 bags of old banknotes out into the darkness. 15 minutes later, the train robbers put handcuffs on Mills and Whitby and warned them not to try to escape for at least half an hour. Then, leaving 8 bags behind, they disappeared into the night. The robbery had taken a total of 24 minutes. The 120 mail bags contained 2.5 million pounds in old notes. Today, that would be about 25 million pounds, and at the time, it was the biggest robbery ever. The newspapers were soon calling it the crime of the century, and the post office quickly offered £10,000 for information that would lead to the arrest of the robbers. How did the robbers change the railway signal from go to stop was one of the first things detectives wanted to know. They soon had the answer. The robbers had covered the green go signal with a glove, then used their own red light which they had brought with them. But where were they now? Weeks before, The gang had bought an old farmhouse called Leatherslade Farm, about 50 kilometers from the bridge. They went there after the robbery to count their money. Each man would get more than £150,000. They had planned to stay at the farmhouse for 4 days, but during the afternoon of Thursday, August 8th, they heard something on the radio news that made them change their plans. Buckinghamshire police announced that they were sure the gang were hiding not more than 50 kilometers from Bridego Bridge. In fact, the police were only guessing this because Mills and Whitby had been told not to try to get help for 30 minutes. The gang would have needed longer than this to go more than 50 kilometers to a hiding place. The gang left Leatherslade Farm on Friday, August 9th. By the following Monday, the police had found the farmhouse where they were hiding. Inside were post office mailbags. Before long, detectives had found the fingerprints of several people in the gang, some of whom were well-known criminals. Bruce Reynolds, Buster Edwards, Ronnie Biggs, Bob Welch, Roy James, John Daly, and Charlie Wilson. Now began the job of finding them. Roger Cordray, who had fixed the railway signal to show red instead of green, and Bill Bowl, another of the robbers, tried to find a garage for their van in Bournemouth. But they picked the wrong person to ask. The owner of the garage was the widow of a policeman, and she immediately suspected something when the robbers paid her from a thick packet of banknotes. She phoned the police while the two men were putting their van into the garage. The police caught them and found £78,892 in the van. More of the money was found in 4 suitcases in a wood in Surrey on August 16th. Then another £30,000 was discovered in the ceiling of a caravan parked near the wood. By the end of the year, most of the gang had been caught. Charlie Wilson was arrested without any trouble at his Clapham home. Roy James was more difficult to catch. He was hiding in a house in St. John's Wood in North London. But when he saw the police, James took a bag containing £12,000 and climbed up onto the roof to try and escape. He jumped and ran along neighbors' roofs, but more than 40 policemen were in the surrounding streets, and James finally jumped down into the waiting arms of one of them. John Daly was arrested the same day. Buster Edwards, Bruce Reynolds, and Jimmy White were still missing. And so was £2 million. The trial of the others began on January 24, 1964, at Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire. The police did not want the trial to take place at the Old Bailey, the famous London criminal court, because they were afraid powerful London criminals might frighten people on the jury. All the prisoners were tried together, and all but Roger Cordray pleaded not guilty. The trial took 2 months. Neither Jack Mills or David Whitby could be sure which had been the men behind the balaclavas, and nobody had seen the robbers at the farm. But the lawyers brought in a total of 200 witnesses. The judge took 6 days to talk to the jury, and the jury took 2 days to decide that all the robbers except John Daly were guilty. The guilty men were sent to prison for up to 30 years. Jimmy White was finally caught in Dover on the south coast of England. Police suspected that he was trying to get abroad. Buster Edwards gave himself up in 1966, and Bruce Reynolds, the leader of the gang, was finally caught in 1968. He was arrested in Torquay, in Devon, and was sent to jail for 25 years. 2 of the gang were not in jail for long. In August 1964, Charlie Wilson escaped from Birmingham's Winson Green prison when 3 men broke into the prison to release him, even though prison officers were watching him carefully because they suspected that he was a person likely to try to escape. In July 1965, Ronnie Biggs got out of Wandsworth prison with 3 other prisoners while they were walking between the prison buildings. The 4 men climbed the 6-meter prison wall using a rope ladder, which had been thrown down by one member of an escape gang outside. Charlie Wilson went to France and Mexico after his escape, but was finally caught again in Canada in 1967. Ronnie Biggs finally went to live in Brazil after first escaping to Australia. He is still there, living in Rio de Janeiro with his girlfriend, Raimunda Castro, and their child. There is nothing that English lawyers or the English police can do about it. In 1993, Biggs said that 4 gang members were never caught. Nobody, other than the robbers and possibly a few other criminals, knows who they are.